organised by RAM, the Residents' Action Movement. A prime catalyst for the Voices of Peace meetings was the Mosques Miracles tour, organised in New Zealand around the same time to spread the message of Islamophobia. The Mosques Miracles tour has been inspired by a 400-page book of the same name, written by Australian right-wing Baptist pastor Stuart Robinson. Galloway defines Islamophobia as racism against Muslims. This new racism, says the British MP, is an inevitable flow-on from the deliberately misnamed War on Terror, begun by Washington to monopolise oil fields in the Muslim Middle East as part of the US state's strategy to remain the world's dominant power. As a prominent anti-war politician, George Galloway was targeted by a US black propaganda campaign in an attempt to blacken his reputation as a grassroots advocate. Falsely accused of being in the pay of Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, Galloway demanded to testify before the US Senate in May 2005. There he turned the tables against the powerful elites profiting from death and destruction in the Middle East, putting them on trial for crimes against humanity. In March this year, British enforcement authorities admitted that George Galloway had no case to answer. Galloway is one of the West's most high-profile opponents of Islamophobia. In his Auckland meetings, Galloway pointed to the close link between America's wars in the Middle East and its state-fueled Islamophobia, which attempts to give ideological justification to Washington's unjust crusade for oil and power. Born in 1954 in Dundee, at the age of 26, he was chairman of Labour in Scotland. At 32, he was in the House of Commons, beating Roy Jenkins in Glasgow's Hillhead, a Tory stronghold for generations. He is an excellent orator who captures people's imagination and commands respect.
I'd like you to first of all to start and perhaps outline how you first became involved in the movement, the left movement.
Well, I was born into a political household. My mother and father were both activists in the trade unions in Scotland and in the Labour Party. I come from an Irish background on my mother's side, so I had a keen understanding of what the British Empire meant. Once I came home and told my Irish grandfather that the teacher had said Britain had an empire so vast that on it the sun never set. And my grandfather answered, that's because God would never trust the British in the dark. And I never had cause to doubt him. So I come from a long line of anti-imperialist and progressive people. And that's the way I grew up, and it's the way I've lived my life. I've lived a political life. I'm grateful for that. I was 36 years in the Labour Party. I was expelled over the Iraq War. I was one of the leaders of the anti-war movement in Britain, which brought millions onto the streets of London and elsewhere against the coming carnage in Iraq. And I'm one of the leaders of Respect, which is a party which grew out of the anti-war movement and which has united Muslim and non-Muslim, young and old, black and white, all over the country in an attempt to create a new politics out of the anti-war movement. I became involved with the Muslim world well over 30 years ago now through my work on Palestine, which started in the middle 1970s, continues until now. And from that involvement with the Palestine question has grown a wider engagement with the Arab world and then the broader Muslim world. And so I'm reasonably qualified, I think, to speak about the things I've been speaking about in New Zealand at the weekend. And who knows, maybe I'll be back in these parts again before long. I've just heard that there's a lot of invitations from Australian organisations to come there. Well, I can't on this trip, but maybe I'll make another before long.
George, since the US invasion of Iraq, we have seen some groups trying to whip up racist hysteria with a hate campaign against Muslims, in particular in this country and also around the world. Can you outline your views on how this phenomenon has arisen?
Well, we said it would be inevitable, that it was the other side of the coin. If you think that making war against Muslim countries is not going to generate a kind of drumbeat of anti-Muslim prejudice in your own home country, then you haven't learned any lessons. The reality is that if every bomb in the world that's falling is falling on Muslims and is being dropped by non-Muslims, and the demonization of Islam, of Muslims, of Muslim countries, Muslim leaders is driven to the point of justification of war, then inevitably there will be waves that travel in the wake of such aggression. And if we're lucky, it will be confined to a few crazed Christian fundamentalist neocon clerics who ship over from Australia to try and encourage New Zealanders to throw rocks at their local Muslim neighbours. If we're unlucky, it will develop as it has in parts of the United States and sometimes in Britain and in other places too, into the kind of actions, the kind of words, the kind of atmosphere that will lead to the alienation of Muslims in countries like New Zealand. And as a result of that alienation, there will germinate many negative problems. And in Britain, we have much melancholy experience of this.
You talked a little bit about Respect and your involvement in that organisation in the UK. How do you see the best way is to overcome this wave of Islamophobia, both in the UK and here in New Zealand?
Definitely the way we have approached it is similar to the way that organisations like RAM are approaching it in New Zealand, which is to try and make a unity between the Muslims and the progressive people who are just as angry as the Muslims are at the foreign policies of Western governments and Western-orientated Southern governments like that of Australia and to a lesser extent New Zealand. What we say to Muslims is, we know you're angry, you're right to be angry, but the best way to be angry is to make one hand with non-Muslims who feel the same way as you do about these foreign policies. And that's been a big success in Britain. It's one of the reasons why the anti-war movement grew so large in Britain. It's one of the reasons for the success of Respect. There are other countries where that unity has not been forged. In New Zealand, I think it's on its way to being forged, and it will find its political expression too in forthcoming elections. And that's a good thing, because the Muslims in New Zealand are 45,000 in a population of 4 million. This is a tiny percentage, and the Muslims will be isolated if they're left alone. At the same time, it is the duty of progressive people to stand up for the downtrodden, those on the end of the lash of bigotry and prejudice. If not them, who? If not the left, who will stand to defend the Muslims?
Racism's not the sort of thing that can be ignored. It can grow like a cancer. Is that how you feel?
Yes, and to mix the medical metaphor, it's also a virus, and it can be transmitted. And Australia is only 3 hours away, and we have in New Zealand at this moment proselytizers of hate who've come from New Zealand, but who emerge from the swamp of neocon Christian fundamentalism in the United States, whose task is to whip up hatred against Muslims, to tear the fabric of New Zealand society apart, to set neighbour against neighbour, and to sow the seeds of future hatreds. And that must be combated. As soon as it raises its ugly head, it has to be confronted, and that's why I'm here in New Zealand this weekend.
If it is not combated and effectively challenged, what do you see the outcome?
Well, it will grow because there are always knuckleheads who are prepared to believe propaganda, and there are always pernicious forces who are ready to peddle this false propaganda. And if it's not confronted by articulate and clear argument, then we'll lose the advantage we currently have in New Zealand, that the country has a sensible majority of reasonable people who don't want to be at war with or in hatred of anybody. That's the traditional New Zealand way, That's the way that New Zealand became famous around the world for, and it's the way we must try to defend. But if you don't defend it, it can be overrun, and it can be overrun by these negative forces of hatred that have come across the Tasman Sea from Australia to spread their hateful message, and we must combat it, and that's why I've come all this way for such a short visit.
George, you've been very vocal against the war for some time, and as a result, you've been attacked by the government, in particular Blair. Do you want to outline how that has come about?
Well, not really, because I didn't come all this way to speak about me, but I'm being punished by the government, by the powerful, because I was right about Iraq, which is much more important to me than any punishment they can hand out to me. Everywhere I go, I draw large crowds of people who listen to what I've got to say. I'm on the radio, national radio in Britain, 6 hours a week. 1 million people a week are listening to me. That's all much more important than the disapproval of those who took us into this disaster in Iraq. If I were approved by them, I'd be worried. If I were being given medals by them, I'd be worried. The only medals I care for are the respect of the ordinary people, amongst whom I've been working for decades. And I have that, and they can't take that away from me. They can suspend me from the British Parliament, but if you'd seen the British Parliament recently, you'd regard that as not much of a punishment.
And how has that movement been built up, that respect you just talked about?
I think by a clear anti-imperialist leadership who understood that wars don't just come out of thin air. They're not a result even of the wickedness of the political leaders who happened to be in power at the time. Although we have had the misfortune to be governed by two pretty wicked leaders, Mr. Bush and Mr. Blair, over this last period. But that wars emerge ineluctably from the economic system that we have in the world, where the rich exploit the poor and where the rich countries exploit the poor countries, and where the control of markets and supplies of raw materials and basic commodities, the control of the labor market, the control of the mineral wealth of the world, especially oil, that's where wars come from. And we had that vision clearly. All of our leaders are veteran opponents of the Vietnam War and fascism in Chile and so on. And secondly, the determination to create unity. We never had any blood tests in the anti-war movement in Britain. We never asked people to sign up for the full anti-imperialist program. We said, if you're against this war, if you're against Britain becoming an empire again, join with us. And the millions did. And we marched, and we found the limitations of marching. And the limitations were demarcated when the doors of power were slammed in our face, however many millions of us there were. So we realized that marching was necessary but not sufficient, that we had to march, yes, but we had to vote also, and we had to have people to vote for. We had to have a party which represented this anti-war feeling, and that's what we've tried to create.
Freedom fighters are often dubbed as terrorists. Isn't it a paradox that double standards pervade in whatever policies the big powers follow? King David's Hotel in Jerusalem is a case in point.
Well, it is interesting that the honorary consul of Israel, to his everlasting shame, was present at the Islam-baiting, Muslim-hating Australian neocon conference, which took place last week in New Zealand. And it is a paradox that no country talks about terrorism more, but has practiced it more than anyone else, and that is the State of Israel. Israel came into being as a result of a terrorist campaign. The King David Hotel in Jerusalem was blown up, killing 98 British civilian clerks and civil servants and some military officers. British sergeants were hanged in the orange groves by the Zionist terror gangs. And of course the Palestinians above all were driven out of their country by a terrorist campaign, by the razing of villages, the massacres of places like Deir Yassin and others. So Israel only exists because of a terrorist movement and the two murder gangs of the Irgun and the Stern gang. And yet Israel, which is the beneficiary of terrorism, likes to blame the victims of its terrorism as terrorists themselves. And worse than that, the governments of the world largely believe that and largely accept that, so that the victim of terror is called the terrorist, and the terrorist is called the victim. Look, any country which is invaded and occupied by foreign military force, foreign armies, is going to resist. Any self-respecting person would resist foreign armies invading their countries, parking their tanks on their streets, looting their national wealth, appointing and dispatching the governments of the day, choosing presidents and prime ministers, not for what they're going to do for the country, but for what they're going to do for the country of the occupier. And this is not terrorism by any remote stretch of the imagination. The Iraqis, for example, have an absolute legal and moral right to resist foreign occupation, and they are doing so. They don't need any encouragement from anyone to do so. They have done so from the first day. The Palestinian people, whose part of whose land has been occupied for 40 years in defiance of international law, and the rest of whose land has been occupied for almost 60 years, and whose country was wiped off the map, are of course going to resist it. Now, any sensible person knows that real terrorism is the deliberate harming of innocent people for political purposes. Now, that's terrorism whether it's practiced by a man in a suit in the White House or Whitehall, or by a man with a beard and a turban living in the Tora Bora in Afghanistan. The harming of innocent people for political purposes is a crime, and it's a sin. And it's a crime in any language, it's a sin in any religion. The difference between people like me and people like Bush and Blair is that we believe that terrorism is what's happening not just on the London Underground or on London buses or in the Twin Towers of New York, but terrorism is also what happened to Fallujah, what happened in Afghanistan, what's happened in Najaf and Karbala and Baghdad and Mosul, what's happened in Bethlehem and Ramallah as well as in Gaza. All of this is terror. All of this is terrorism, and we're against all of it. And there's a big swamp of hatred that I speak about, which has been created by Western policy and the double standards especially towards the Palestine question, which has led to the emergence of many monstrous things. The Twin Tower attack was one, the London Underground bombings another. But these things cannot be understood without taking into account the far, far greater level of killings and torture and suffering inflicted by Western governments on Muslims around the world. If you don't understand that, you're never going to beat the bombers.
And it's part of it demonizing the whole people to justify the war.
Yes, you see, if you start from the assumption that Islam is uniquely violent, though how any Christian, knowing Christian history, could describe Islam as uniquely violent is of course preposterous. If you start from the assumption that a Muslim is a problem rather than a neighbor who prays differently to you, you're going to start generating demands for new laws and a new arm's length, anxious, maybe even fearful approach to your neighbor, and he's going to feel that, and he's going to withdraw from your society, and having withdrawn, there will be siren voices trying to lure the young men from the Muslim community onto the rocks of separatism and violence, and we mustn't get into this vicious cycle. We've got it in Britain, and we're trying to deal with the consequences of it. You don't have it in New Zealand, and you should not go quietly into that good night.
flag bearers of human rights perpetuate atrocities and terrorise the civil population of Palestine, Iraq and Afghanistan, as you've been outlining. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as I say, the invasions and occupations of these countries are generating hatred which will haunt us for generations. I think the invasion of Iraq in particular has scarred the face of the international legal and political system and disfigured it beyond recognition. And it will be very hard to cosmetically repair that. Our children, their children, yet unborn, will still feel the reverberations of the crimes that have been committed over this last 4 years. If you look at Afghanistan, the poorest country in the world, occupied by the richest countries in the world, there were no Afghans on the aeroplanes on 9/11. Afghanistan is being punished twice. It was punished first when bin Laden and his obscurantist fanatics were sent to Afghanistan in the first place by Britain and America and other Western countries in order in pursuit of the immoral principle that my enemy's enemy is my friend. Their enemy was the Soviet Union, and therefore bin Laden, who was against the Soviet Union, was their friend. But you see, sometimes your enemy, your enemy's enemy can be worse than your enemy. These people have never read the Dr. Frankenstein story to the end. Dr. Frankenstein lost control of his monster. That's why it's a monster. You can't control a monster. And that's what we did with the bin Laden phenomenon, the people who became the Taliban, who became all the different warlords of obscurantism in Afghanistan. And it's what we're doing now in Iraq. We got rid of Saddam Hussein and replaced him by people who are much worse than Saddam Hussein. Iraq was one country under one dictator 4 years ago. Now it's 100 different countries with 100 dictators.
Warlords,
yes.
You have said that an axis of aggression links Tel Aviv and Washington with London at the midpoint, and it has Tehran as its site. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, there's a very real danger that Iran will be attacked either by the United States or by Israel, which will add up to the same thing, and maybe soon. George Bush's term is running out. The neocons, especially Dick Cheney, the vice president, and the Israeli government, which is all at sea and in real trouble and under pressure from its right, from Netanyahu. It may very well be that a critical mass of conditions is coalescing that will lead to a decision to attack Iran. And if that happens, it will be the worst decision that anybody ever made. It will make the Iraq story puny by comparison, because Iran is not a small adversary. Iran is 75 million people, a rich country, which will rally behind its regime. Even those who don't like the regime will rally behind it. And Iran will answer any attack. She will answer first and foremost in Iraq, where the country will immediately become ungovernable and coalition troops will be slaughtered, massacred on the streets. She will answer in the Persian Gulf, in the Arabian Gulf. She'll set the oil fields of Qatar and other places on fire within moments of any attack on her. She will answer in Lebanon, where she has friends, as we know. She will answer in Palestine. She will answer around the world. It will be war throughout the world if these people attack Iran. And I was going to say, if they have any sense, they will not do so. But of course, the last 4 years has demonstrated that the US government has no sense. It is a giant with the mind of a child, led by an imbecile who appears utterly oblivious, ignorant of the world in which he's roaming around as the single superpower. So be afraid of such a development, and if it occurs, nowhere, not even New Zealand, will be immune from the blowback that will occur.
Thank you, George.
Thanks.
Next week.
There doesn't seem to be any problems. We're certainly not second-class citizens or oppressed or repressed and stuck at home. There are Muslim women in all professional fields out there working in all walks